In the late summer of 1839, when Virginia's plantations shimmered under a sickly gold sun, travelers along the Blackthorn Trail often spoke of a mansion where light seemed afraid to linger. Its owner, Dr. Nathaniel Hawthorne, had once been a man of medicine and reason, but grief had carved something hollow inside him, something that whispered of creation and control. They said he believed perfection could be designed, that the boundaries of flesh and soul were his to rearrange. No one knew what he meant until the births began. The first rumors came from the servants, women who vanished for a season, returning thin and trembling, cradling infants they swore were not their own. The townsfolk dismissed it as hysteria until a midwife described a newborn with eyes the color of mercury and a pulse that slowed when sunlight touched its skin. Soon, strange men arrived at the estate, paid in coin heavy enough to buy silence. No one asked what their purpose was, but everyone knew. By autumn, the Blackthorn mansion had become a wound upon the countryside, a place where screams carried only so far before the wind swallowed them whole. And when the scholar arrived, answering a letter that should never have found him, he discovered that some experiments were never meant to end because the results were already walking among. The year was 1839, and the road to Blackthorn Estate stretched through endless fields of dying tobacco, the air thick with rot and the sweet decay of late summer. Travelers rarely took this path after sundown, for the land had a way of swallowing sound and sense, leaving only the hum of cicadas and the distant echo of something unseen. It was on this road that a young scholar named Elias Morton journeyed, clutching a letter stamped with a seal of black wax. The message had come unbidden, a brief invitation written in a physician's precise hand, promising access to rare medical texts and ancient theories on human anatomy. Elias, eager to make his name in the academic circles of Richmond, accepted without hesitation, unaware that the letter had already claimed several before him. As he neared the estate, the trees grew closer together, their limbs intertwining like veins, blocking out the sun. When the mansion finally emerged through the mist, it did not rise with grandeur but rather loomed, its brick walls bruised with ivy and its windows shrouded in the dull glow of candlelight. There was a stillness to it, a kind of deliberate quiet, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The gates creaked open at his approach, as if expecting him, and he felt an unease take root beneath his ribs, a feeling that something within was waiting, aware of him long before his arrival. At the door stood a tall man in mourning black, his face pale but composed. He introduced himself as Dr. Nathaniel Hawthorne, voice smooth as glass yet curiously detached, as if he were speaking from some great distance. His eyes lingered on Elias for a moment too long before he offered a thin smile and welcomed him inside. The air smelled faintly of herbs, metal, and something sour beneath it, something like old blood. Portraits lined the hallways, generations of Hawthorns staring down with expressions too lifelike, their eyes glinting when the light caught them. No servants were present, yet the faint sound of movement echoed from the floor above, rhythmic and unhurried. Dr. Hawthorne spoke little during supper, his attention fixed on the fire as though listening to something in the flames. When Elias inquired about the rumored laboratory on the property, the doctor's lips twitched, and for an instant his calm faltered. He spoke then of progress, of the fragility of creation, of a world not yet perfected. His words hung in the air like a prayer spoken backward. That night, as Elias lay awake in his guest room, he heard footsteps outside his door, slow, deliberate, and inhumanly light, followed by the soft wail of an infant that could not possibly exist in that house. From the moment Elias began observing the daily life within Blackthorn Estate, he noticed that the servants carried a strange heaviness about them, as if their very movements were rehearsed performances meant to conceal dread. They rarely spoke above a whisper and avoided one another's eyes. When he tried to engage them in polite conversation, they would offer stiff smiles that dissolved quickly into silence. The few words they let slip were veiled in superstition, mentions of the doctor's blessings, the chosen nights, and the returning women. These phrases puzzled Elias, but the tone in which they were uttered carried a weight of terror, not reverence. It was clear that the servants were bound by more than loyalty, they were bound by fear. At night, when the mansion settled into its uneasy stillness, Elias often overheard muffled conversations through the thin walls. Voices trembled as they spoke of rooms locked from the inside, of candles burning past midnight, of women who disappeared for weeks at a time and returned altered, pale, unsteady, their eyes vacant as though they had left part of themselves somewhere they could never return to. The men on the estate fared no better. They kept their heads down, their hands always occupied, refusing to discuss the evening appointments that took place in the West Wing, where no one but Dr. Hawthorne was allowed to enter. It was there, Elias learned, that the air smelled of damp linen, medicine, and something faintly metallic. One evening, while walking past the servants' quarters, Elias caught the faint sound of crying behind a half-closed door. Inside, two maids huddled near the hearth, clutching rosaries and whispering prayers. When they noticed him, they froze, and one of them hastily wiped her tears before muttering, "We are only asking for mercy, sir. For those who went before us." Before Elias could question her, she rose and left the room, her face drained of color. The other servant, trembling, whispered that the doctor was helping the world begin anew, and that none of them had the right to refuse him. Her words carried the hopeless cadence of someone repeating a belief forced upon her. In the following days, the pattern became undeniable. Elias noticed the same women who whispered at night now avoiding mirrors, their reflections seemingly unbearable to them. He saw their trembling hands when the doctor passed by, their quiet flinches when he spoke their names. What unsettled him most was the sound that came from the West Wing every few nights, an unmistakable rhythm of life and suffering intermingled, muffled by the thick walls but alive enough to twist his sleep into feverish dreams he could not escape. Elias first saw the greenhouse on his third day at Blackthorn Estate. From his window, just beyond the overgrown hedges and the rotting orchard, a glint of sunlight flashed off glass panes veiled in creeping ivy. It stood apart from the main house like a forbidden shrine, half consumed by the forest that encircled the property. Curiosity gnawed at him, but whenever he asked the servants about it, they would fall silent, their faces tightening as if the very mention of that place was dangerous. One woman dropped the tray she was carrying when he pressed the question, muttering a prayer before fleeing down the hall. That night, Elias saw Dr. Hawthorne walking toward the greenhouse alone, a lantern in one hand, his shadow bending unnaturally against the fog. When morning came, Elias followed the same path, the damp soil soft beneath his boots and the air thick with the smell of decay. The greenhouse was immense, its iron frame rusting at the joints and its door locked with a heavy chain that looked recently polished. Through the grimy glass, he could just make out strange silhouettes, tables, jars, and what appeared to be medical instruments glinting in the dim light. But what truly unsettled him was the faint sound that leaked through the cracks in the glass, a fragile, rhythmic whimper that he first mistook for an animal. The closer he leaned, the clearer it became. It was the cry of an infant, soft yet unmistakable, rising and falling as though calling for something that would never come. Heart-pounding, Elias circled the structure, searching for an opening. Every pane was sealed, every latch rusted shut, except for one small ventilation slit near the ground. The air that seeped from it carried a sterile chill, tinged with something metallic and rotten, a scent that reminded him of anatomy lectures and dissected specimens. Beneath that odor, however, lingered something stranger, the faint, sweet smell of milk. Inside, movement stirred. A faint shuffle, followed by a wet, choking cough. Then silence. Elias stumbled backward, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and terror. He turned and saw, in the distance, the doctor watching from the edge of the trees, his expression unreadable. That night, Elias dreamt of the greenhouse glowing from within, its glass panels pulsing like the skin of some living thing. In his dream, dozens of small faces pressed against the glass, pale and blurred, their mouths opening in silent screams. When he awoke, the faint echo of that same infant's cry drifted in through his window, carried by the wind from the direction of the greenhouse, as if the thing inside had followed him into waking life. The discovery of the ledger came by accident on a rain-drenched evening when Elias sought refuge in the estate's library, a cavernous room that smelled of damp paper and dusted leather. Lightning flickered through tall windows, casting brief, skeletal light over shelves filled with old medical treatises and handwritten journals. As he browsed the collection, his fingers brushed against a loose panel at the base of a bookcase. Behind it lay a compartment lined with velvet, and within it rested a single, leather-bound volume, its cover unmarked but for a faint indentation where a seal might once have been. The edges were stained with something that could have been ink, though in that dim light it looked uncomfortably darker. Elias opened it carefully, and at first, it seemed to be a simple financial record. Each line listed a date, a name, and a payment. But the longer he read, the more wrong it became. The entries were organized not by trade or labor but by something more intimate. The names were unfamiliar men from neighboring towns, farmhands, travelers, sailors, each followed by a column labeled service rendered and another marked with a sum of money. Some names had notes beside them in Dr. Hawthorne's neat, clinical handwriting, asterisk healthy build, strong lineage, no visible defects. Asterisk at first, Elias thought it might be a record of hired workers for the estate, but then came the chilling realization next to each man's name was another, written in delicate script, almost reverently. These were the names of the women who served within the house. The ledger was not a record of employment. It was a registry of transactions, each documenting the doctor's twisted experiment. He had paid strangers to perform their part in his vision of creation, matching men to women as if pairing livestock, their fates sealed by his pen. Some entries were followed by single words like confirmed, viable, or, more disturbingly, rejected. The final pages recorded the outcomes, dates of conception, births, and deaths, coldly listed without emotion, as if they were scientific data points rather than lives. Elias felt the room tilt around him as he realized the scale of what he had uncovered. Dozens of entries spanned years, suggesting this had been no momentary obsession but a deliberate, methodical pursuit. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the glass in its frame. He turned one final page and froze at the sight of a familiar name, Elise, the servant who had once warned him to leave. Next to her name, the word pending had been crossed out and replaced with completed. The ink was still fresh, glistening faintly under the lamplight. The diary of Mrs. Hawthorne was discovered by chance, hidden beneath a false bottom in her writing desk, which sat untouched in an upstairs parlor sealed since her death. Elias found it one morning when the doctor had gone to town and the house felt momentarily freed from its suffocating presence. The air in that room was thick with dust, the curtains drawn so long that sunlight entered in thin, reluctant streaks. The diary itself was small, its cover of faded blue velvet embroidered with her initials. Its pages were yellowed, fragile to the touch, but her handwriting was graceful, unnervingly calm. The early entries were ordinary enough, filled with notes about garden parties, church visits, and the loneliness of being a wife to a man consumed by his work. Yet as the pages turned, her tone began to shift, and the domestic warmth bled away, replaced by confusion, fear, and a slow unraveling of sanity. She wrote of her husband's growing obsession with what he called the refinement of the human species. He spoke of generations shaped by accident and imperfection, of nature's failures that he believed he could correct. At first, she had dismissed his talk as intellectual indulgence, the sort of madness brilliant men often hid behind scientific words. But when he began to invite strangers to the house, paying them handsomely for what he called participation, she realized his ideas had found form in practice. She described late nights when she heard laughter that was not her husband's, the muffled sound of footsteps in the servants' corridor, and once, a scream that was quickly silenced. Her writing grew frantic in the margins, lines repeating phrases like he believes he can make purity and he wants to build what God would not. In one of the final entries, she confessed that she had confronted him. She had demanded to know why the servants were disappearing and why their children did not live past infancy. His answer, she wrote, chilled her to the bone. He told her that perfection required sacrifice, that suffering was the soil in which evolution thrived. He spoke of her womb as the first vessel of his grand design and lamented that it had failed to give him a lasting creation. The last entry ended abruptly, a smear of ink trailing off the page, as if the pen had been torn from her hand. When Elias closed the diary, he realized that Mrs. Hawthorne had not died of illness as the doctor had claimed. Her final words, half-finished and trembling, suggested something far darker had silenced her forever. Elias met Elise again one rain-soaked night when the storm howled against the shutters and the corridors of Blackthorn seemed alive with whispers. She appeared at his door trembling, her hair clinging to her face, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. She had been gone for weeks, vanished suddenly, with no explanation from Dr. Hawthorne or the remaining servants. Now she stood before him, drenched and shaking, her clothes torn, the faint scent of earth and blood clinging to her skin. She begged him not to tell anyone she had returned, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. Elias, seeing the desperation in her eyes, let her inside and locked the door behind them. It was then she began to speak, her words trembling out of her as if they had been waiting too long to escape. Elise confessed that she had been chosen. The doctor had told her it was an honor, that she would help him restore the purity of mankind. He had promised payment, safety, even comfort, but when the night came, she understood that none of it was true. She was taken to the West Wing, where the curtains were drawn and the smell of chemicals stung her eyes. There were other men there, strangers, brought in from outside, their faces hidden by masks, their movements mechanical. The doctor stood over them, instructing, observing, recording every detail as though he were conducting an experiment rather than orchestrating an act of horror. Elise said that afterward she had been locked away, fed sparingly, and told she was carrying something new, something that would change the world. But the baby never came. Instead, sickness did. She fled in the dead of night, following the road through the woods until the mansion's lights disappeared behind her. As she spoke, Elias felt the truth settle like ice in his stomach. Everything he had suspected about the ledger, the locked greenhouse, the cries in the night, it was all real, and worse than his mind had dared to imagine. Elise's body bore the marks of her suffering, thin scars at her wrists, bruises fading along her collarbone, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. She said there were others still inside, women who hadn't managed to escape, women whose silence the doctor purchased with fear. Before dawn, she made Elias promise to leave, to take the diary and the ledger and run before the doctor discovered she had returned. But as the morning light crept across the floorboards, they heard footsteps echoing in the hallway outside his room, slow and deliberate, and Elise's face went pale with recognition. She whispered that it was already too late. The sound came first, faint, almost like the wind slipping through cracks in the cellar door. Elias had been pacing the study, his mind consumed by Elise's story, when it reached him, a low, rhythmic wail that rose and fell with the steadiness of a heartbeat. It was not the sound of wind. It was the cry of a newborn. He froze, every instinct urging him to ignore it, to pretend he had heard nothing, but curiosity, dark and irresistible, drew him toward the source. The hallways of Blackthorn were dim, lit only by oil lamps that flickered with each gust of the storm outside. He followed the noise down the narrow servant staircase, the boards groaning beneath his feet, until he reached the door to the cellar. It was locked, but from beneath it came that unmistakable sound again, soft and shuddering, like a plea trapped in the dark. Finding a rusted key on a nearby hook, Elias hesitated only for a moment before turning the lock. The door opened with a slow creak, releasing a wave of air so cold it made him shiver. A single lantern burned near the far wall, illuminating shelves lined with glass jars that shimmered faintly in the gloom. The smell hit him next, something sour, chemical, and thick, mingled with the faint sweetness of decay. As he descended, the crying grew louder, echoing against the stone walls until it was impossible to tell where it came from. He turned a corner and saw a series of small wooden cradles arranged in a row, each covered with a thin cloth. His heart thudded violently as he stepped closer, the sound of his breath loud in his ears. He lifted one of the cloths and recoiled. What lay beneath was not a child as he knew one. Its skin was waxen, grayish, and translucent enough for blue veins to show beneath the surface. Its eyes were open, milky, and unblinking, and its lips moved in a trembling imitation of life. The sound, the terrible, fragile cry, was coming from it. Elias stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. In the cradle beside it, another small form twitched, a hand curling weakly toward the light. They were breathing, if such a thing could be called breath. On a nearby table lay instruments, scalpels, syringes, glass vials filled with thick, amber fluid. Notes were scattered across the surface, each page marked with Dr. Hawthorne's precise handwriting detailing post-birth stabilization and duration of viability. Elias turned, shaking, and in that moment the crying ceased. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, and from behind him, in the shadows, he heard the slow creak of the cellar door closing. Elias could no longer think of the house as a home but as a vast, breathing organism, alive, watchful, feeding on secrets. He avoided the cellar after that night, yet what he had seen there followed him everywhere. Each creak of the floor, each flicker of the lamps, reminded him of the unnatural rhythm of those tiny lungs. One afternoon, while wandering the parlor in search of air that did not taste of fear, His eyes caught the glint of something behind a dusty veil. The painting hung above the grand fireplace, larger than any other in the house, its frame gilded and cracked with age. He had walked past it many times without truly seeing it. But that day, when he brushed away the cobwebs, the figure within came to life in the dim firelight. It was a portrait of Dr. Hawthorne's late wife, rendered in exquisite, haunting detail. Her expression was serene, almost holy, yet her eyes seemed to follow him across the room with unnatural precision. There was something in the shape of her mouth, the curve of her cheek, that stirred an uneasy recognition. He stepped closer, his heart quickening. The face was beautiful, yes, but not in a human way. It was symmetrical to a fault, every feature so precise it felt mechanical, calculated rather than born. Then he saw it, the faintest hint of silver in the eyes, the same color he had seen reflected in the milky gaze of the creatures in the cellar. His pulse stilled. The resemblance was undeniable. Those infants, those experiments, bore the unmistakable imprint of the woman in the portrait. Elias leaned closer and noticed something else, a thin inscription at the bottom corner of the frame, nearly lost beneath the dust. It read, "Perfection is not born. It is made." The words were written in Dr. Hawthorne's hand. As Elias studied the painting, a reflection moved behind him in the glass, a figure standing in the doorway, silent and still. He turned sharply, but no one was there. The air in the room grew colder, and the fire seemed to shrink, its light receding as if afraid. When he looked back at the portrait, the illusion of serenity had vanished. The painted woman's lips seemed to have curved into the faintest smile, delicate yet knowing, and her gaze no longer felt fixed upon him but beyond him, toward something unseen. Elias felt a tremor run through the floorboards, faint but rhythmic, almost like the flutter of a heartbeat, as though the house itself was acknowledging his discovery, and the woman in the frame was waiting for him to understand what she had become. The night of the fire began with a silence too complete to trust. The air around Blackthorn Estate was thick, unmoving, as though the land itself had stopped breathing. Elias had resolved to leave by dawn, his mind tormented by the diary, the ledger, and the horrors he had witnessed below. But before he could gather his things, a sharp crack split the stillness, followed by the unmistakable scent of smoke. From his window, he saw an orange glow blooming behind the greenhouse, swelling like a wound that refused to close. The flames licked up the glass walls, warping them into melting mirrors that reflected the madness consuming the estate. Then came the screams, not human at first, more like the howls of animals caught between birth and death. They rose and fell, a chorus of agony that tore through the quiet night. Elias ran through the halls, shouting for the servants, but most had already fled. The corridors were filled with smoke, and from somewhere deep within the house came the sharp, deliberate footsteps of Dr. Hawthorne. When Elias found him, the man was standing calmly at the base of the grand staircase, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire outside. He looked almost serene, a man admiring his own ruin. "It had to happen," the doctor said, his voice steady, almost tender. "They weren't ready yet. None of them were. But their ashes will give rise to something greater." His words chilled Elias more than the heat ever could. When Elias tried to drag him toward the door, Hawthorne resisted, his gaze fixed on the upper floors where the walls had begun to blister and collapse. A violent explosion from the greenhouse sent shards of glass raining through the night, each piece flashing like a dying star. The doctor turned toward the sound, eyes shining with a strange satisfaction, as if he were witnessing proof of his success. Elias had no choice but to leave him. He stumbled out into the rain, coughing, the acrid smoke clawing at his lungs. Behind him, the mansion burned with a terrible beauty, its windows glowing like the eyes of a dying beast. Through the roar of the fire, he thought he heard crying again, high, piercing wails from within the greenhouse, cut short one by one until only the crackle of flame remained. By morning, Blackthorn was nothing but blackened stone and ash. Searchers found no trace of Dr. Hawthorne, no remains of the infants, no sign of life at all. But for years afterward, villagers swore that on windless nights, the ruins still glowed faintly from within, as though the fire beneath had never truly gone out. Decades passed, and the story of Blackthorn Estate became a whispered legend along the valleys of Virginia, a cautionary tale told to frighten children and warn the curious from venturing near the ruins. The estate itself had long been reclaimed by the forest, its charred remains hidden beneath vines and moss, yet those who lived nearby swore that on mist-heavy nights, a strange light still pulsed faintly from the ground where the greenhouse once stood. For most, it was superstition. But as time moved forward, something began to unsettle the nearby towns, something that no one could explain. Children were being born with eyes too pale for their lineage, their gazes distant and calm. Their manner of speaking was slow, deliberate, eerily measured, as though their minds were older than their bodies. Doctors attributed it to coincidence, genetics, or tricks of memory, but the resemblance among these children, spread across miles and families with no known ties, was impossible to ignore. By the turn of the century, there were dozens of them. They rarely cried as infants and seemed to understand things beyond their years. Some could recall events they had never witnessed, describing the mansion, the fire, and the doctor with chilling clarity. Their dreams were all the same visions of a great burning house and a woman's painted face watching from the flames. Parents who tried to question them soon stopped, unsettled by the calm certainty with which they spoke of the past. The oldest among them began to gather quietly, drawn together by instinct rather than knowledge, meeting near the overgrown remains of Blackthorn as though called by something ancient and unfinished. Locals who passed the area after dusk reported seeing figures moving between the trees, carrying lanterns that glowed too brightly for their size. Some claimed to have heard faint voices humming in unison, repeating a single phrase in an unknown tongue. One farmer who ventured too close found the ground soft and warm beneath his feet, pulsing faintly, as if something beneath the soil still breathed. He left that night and never returned. When he tried to describe what he had seen, his words faltered, but he kept repeating one thing, that their faces were all the same. The descendants of Dr. Hawthorne's creation had lived on, scattered yet bound by blood and purpose, carrying within them the quiet echo of the experiment that should have perished in fire but instead had been perfected in silence.